who actually owns America's $34 trillion debt. It is not who you think. These are the actual owners of the United States national debt. And the biggest one is almost certainly not who you've been told. If you've been losing sleep over China owning America, the next 8 minutes are going to change how you think about this entire conversation. Here is the number that should be on every news ticker in the country. The gross national debt crossed $38 trillion on the 21st of October, 2025, and by May of 2026 it had already blown past $39 trillion, growing by roughly $5 to $6 billion a day. The $34 trillion figure people panicked about back in 2024 is ancient history at this point. We sailed right past it, and the pace never slowed, which raises the question almost nobody answers correctly. When the federal government owes $38 trillion, who exactly holds those IOS? Because the real answer reframes everything you've been hearing on cable news. Let me walk you through it, because once you see the actual breakdown, the political talking points start to fall apart pretty quickly. The Treasury splits the national debt into two buckets, and that distinction matters more than most people realize. Around 80% sits in a category called debt held by the public, which added up to roughly $29 trillion as of March 2025, representing money borrowed from investors in financial markets both at home and overseas. The remaining 20% falls under intragovernmental holdings, totaling about $7.3 trillion as of August 2025, and this is where things get genuinely strange, because that is debt the government owes to itself. 1 out of every $5 of the national debt is money the federal government borrowed from the federal government. Here is how that even works. When Social Security takes in more money than it pays out, the surplus doesn't sit in some vault under the Treasury building. It gets invested by law into special Treasury securities. The trust fund hands cash to the Treasury, and the Treasury hands back an IOU that earns interest like a regular bond. The Social Security Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund alone holds $2.4 trillion of those IOS, which works out to roughly a third of all intragovernmental debt, with the rest spread across federal employee retirement funds, Medicare's Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, and the Highway Trust Fund. There is a real fight about what any of this actually means. The Cato Institute calls the Social Security Trust Fund a figurative piggy bank that holds only IOS issued by the Treasury to the Social Security Administration, not actual money. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities pushes back hard, pointing out that those securities carry the full faith and credit of the United States government, identical in legal status to the Treasury bonds anyone else can buy. Either way, the 2025 Trustees Report projects the trust fund runs dry in 2033, so this stops being an abstract accounting argument very soon. Now let's get to the part everyone wants to know about, which is the other $29 trillion, and the first surprise is a big one. The single largest individual holder of U.S. Treasury debt is the Federal Reserve itself, the central bank that buys and sells treasuries as part of monetary policy. During COVID, the Fed roughly doubled its holdings to prop up the economy, pushing its balance sheet past its previous all-time high of $4.5 trillion by March of 2020. Fed Treasury holdings peaked at about $5.7 trillion in mid-2022, and quantitative tightening has been chipping away at that pile ever since June of 2022, bringing total Fed Treasury holdings down to somewhere between $4.2 and $4.4 trillion by late 2025. Combine the Federal Reserve with all those government trust funds, and the picture flips on its head. First Trust Advisors puts that combined number at roughly $11.5 trillion. The U.S. government, in one form or another, holds about 1/3 of the entire national debt, which is more than China, Japan, the United Kingdom, and every other foreign country in the world combined. Sit with that for a second. The boogeyman in this story turns out to be us. Domestic ownership goes way beyond the Fed and the trust funds, and this is where you and your neighbors quietly show up in the numbers. Mutual funds hold roughly $4.1 trillion in treasuries, which covers the bond funds tucked inside your 401k, your IRA, and your pension. State and local governments hold about $1.8 trillion. Commercial banks and other depository institutions hold another $1.8 trillion. Pension funds hold $975 billion. Insurance companies hold $615 billion. And U.S. savings bonds, the kind your grandparents used to slip into birthday cards, account for $161 billion. Toss in individuals, businesses, brokers, and everyone else, and you're looking at almost $6 trillion more held by domestic investors. Total domestic holdings climbed from $6.9 trillion in March of 2015 to $19.9 trillion 10 years later, which means if you've got any kind of retirement account, odds are decent that you personally are one of the people America owes money to. Now to the part everyone obsesses over: foreign ownership. And the numbers here tell a very different story than the headlines. $9.2 trillion. That is how much U.S. Treasury debt foreign investors held as of December 2025. According to the Congressional Research Service, working out to 31% of the publicly held debt. The dollar figure sounds enormous, and it is, but the context completely reshapes it. Foreign holdings were just $14 billion back in 1970, a measly 5% of the total, and the foreign share actually peaked at 49% in 2011. Which means foreign ownership has been falling as a percentage in recent years, even while the raw dollar amount has grown. Of that $9.2 trillion, foreign governments and central banks own about $3.9 trillion, while the remaining $5.4 trillion sits with private foreign investors, the pension funds in Europe, the banks in Asia, the hedge funds in the Caribbean, not governments. Here is where the rankings break almost everyone's mental model. Japan sits at number 1 with roughly $1.19 trillion as of late 2025. The United Kingdom comes in second, somewhere between $863 and $926 billion. And China lands at number 3 with $683.5 billion. China is third, not first, and this next part almost never makes it into the cable news segment. Chinese holdings peaked around $1.3 trillion back in 2013 and have been cut roughly in half since then, with China's share of total foreign holdings collapsing from over 25% in 2010 to just 7.4% in late 2025, measured against the entire national debt. China owns about 2.2%. So when you hear that China could dump U.S. Treasuries and crash the American economy, understand the actual scale of what is being claimed, which is why First Trust Advisors put it bluntly in April 2025 by saying that fear is overstated. The rest of the foreign top 10 gets even stranger. Belgium holds $477 billion. Canada holds $468 billion. Luxembourg holds $435 billion. The Cayman Islands holds $421 billion. Ireland holds $341 billion. Luxembourg is smaller than Rhode Island and somehow shows up holding nearly $500 billion in U.S. debt. And the Cayman Islands quietly outranks Germany and India. The Treasury itself buries a warning in the footnotes of its own data, explaining that the numbers track the location of the holdings, not the nationality of the owners. Belgium ranks so high because Euroclear, a massive international securities depository, happens to be headquartered there, and the Cayman Islands is packed with hedge funds, many of them American operations running what is called the basis trade. Analysts at Wolf Street estimate the real Cayman number could be closer to $2 trillion once you trace it back to actual ownership, which means a serious chunk of what looks like foreign debt is really American money taking the long way home. The part of this story that should actually worry you isn't who owns the debt. It is the price we're paying just to carry it. $970 billion. That is what the United States spent on interest payments in 2025 alone, according to the Peterson Foundation, with the gal putting the fiscal year 2025 number as high as $1.2 trillion, depending on the measure you use. Foreign holders alone collected $282.4 billion in interest during 2025, and the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget Projects net interest payments will total $13.8 trillion across fiscal years 2026 through 2035. The average interest rate on the marketable debt sat at about 3.4% in late 2025. And as older, cheaper debt matures and gets rolled over at today's rates, the bill climbs higher every month. Debt to GDP now runs above 121%, a level the country hasn't seen since the years right after World War II. Here is where it all lands. The story you've been sold, that China owns America and foreign powers are pulling our strings, isn't really the story at all. America mostly owes this debt to itself, to its own central bank, its own trust funds, its own banks, and its own citizens through their retirement accounts. The biggest creditor of the U.S. government turns out to be the U.S. government, followed closely by American investors, which includes pretty much anyone watching this video with money in a 401k. Foreign governments are real players in the picture, but they're a smaller piece than the headlines suggest, and the largest of them, Japan and the United Kingdom, happen to be close allies. The danger was never that some foreign country would call in the loan. The danger is that the interest payments we now owe to ourselves and everyone else are pushing past $1 trillion a year, and that bill grows every single day. The math goes unaddressed. This isn't a foreign policy problem. It is an arithmetic problem, and the only people who can solve it are the ones holding most of the debt in the first place, which means us. If this changed how you see the national debt, drop a comment and let me know which number caught you most off guard. And if you want to understand what is actually driving the deficits behind all this borrowing, stick around. I'll see you in the next one.